doing things for the wrong reasons, and it doesn't feel good. Again, I would contrast that with Pope Francis, where people are flocking to him. And again, he's not perfect. Well, that was another thing in the 60 Minutes. I would encourage you to go just Google, Pope Francis 60 Minutes, and it will come up. Because that was the other point. The interviewer from 60 Minutes asked, he says, Pope Francis keeps saying that he's a big sinner, that he's one of the biggest sinners. Why does he keep saying that, and yet people flock to him? And the response was, and this response came from, they say he's from Argentina, but he's the rabbi, he's the best friend of the popes, and he's a rabbi. And he said, it's because he's human. It's because he's human. So he's trying to lead by example. And he's trying, and the fact that he admits that he's not perfect makes other people feel comfortable, because we know we're not perfect either. So, but no, you're right, in politics there are all kinds of bad examples. Mm-hmm.
Would that be related to what your focus is? If you're in a leadership position and your focus is yourself, then you're going to serve yourself. But if you're more of a servant leader and your focus is on others, or the mission of the institution, or the constituents, or the position to which you're called, then I think it would be easier, going back to Andy's question, to, even when you're younger, to be able to say, hey, here's how I can stand up for myself, or it's okay if I'm wrong, or I can take the risks involved with that if I'm really focusing on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. And as I said, I kind of narrowed, I wasn't interested in somebody who's out speaking or writing about leadership if they're, chop, 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 I wanted servant leadership. And my definition of servant leadership, beyond that you look at the role as to serve, my definition is that leaders should clear obstacles, not be the obstacle. So leaders are there to make it easier for the rest of us to get our work done, not be a roadblock in the way. And so that was kind of a definition I coined, but yeah, that's a good point. Yes?
In your interviews, did any of the leaders talk about disconnects between leadership and worker bees, and leadership, or I should maybe say the worker bees feeling that the leaders don't really know what's going on down here in the trenches, and therefore there's a disconnect there? Real world, what happens in probably a lot of places.
Right. Yeah, I don't necessarily, that didn't come up because I didn't ask questions about that, but the disconnect came in terms of, that came up in different ways in terms of, I've got a chapter in the book about community, that leaders need to build community, and that it's getting harder and harder to build community. More and more people, in this day of 24/7 interconnectedness, more and more people are lonely. In fact, something I just wrote about the other day, that the founders of Twitter created it because they were lonely. So they said, we need to figure out a way for people to connect faster than Facebook. So, when you walk into a room, you can, so this loneliness, they talked a lot about the disconnect between, and so sometimes I say you need to disconnect to connect. So this whole idea of, I had my students interview leaders, any kind of leader, anyone they consider to be a leader, and I said, I really want you to do it in person, not email. Talk to people, build relationships, because so much of I say leadership is not a position, it's a relationship. So you may be in a position, but if you haven't created the relationships, you're not much of an influence. So that's the way that came up. It's kind of interesting because it was John Witt who pointed out this study to me, Professor Witt, pointed this study out to me, probably about 5 years ago, but it's a sociological study where, and longitudinal, where it was repeated. So 20 years later, basically the findings are that in 20 years, people have fewer people to count on, fewer people they trust, they're lonelier than they were 20 years ago. So, and I use that study because I say, if that's true, then what do most people want from a leader? Okay? They want connection, they want community, they just want somebody to listen to them. One story that often comes to my mind is when I was interim academic vice president, and a faculty member who's no longer here, but he was struggling with some issues, he made an appointment and he came in, and so I listened, and he got quite emotional, and I just let him talk, and pretty soon I said, well, is there something you want me to do? And he looked at me and he said, no, thank you so much. All I really wanted, I just wanted somebody to listen. You know, and I've just always remembered that story because he didn't want answers, he didn't want advice, he didn't want me to take any action. He just wanted to be heard. And so that story's always stuck with me. So I think if you know that, you know, and you know, like if you take my own family as an example, I have 3 kids, New York, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. You know, people are spread out, families are spread out. I grew up 5 miles from my grandmother. I mean, she was a big part of my life. So if you look at people are lonely, you know, then as a leader, you know, that building community, I think is really critical, and looking at your job as ways to do that, and making that a priority. Good, great, Ryan.
I love your story about selecting colleges and then you getting connected with that. It's sometimes easy to see this stuff in your own life and then make those changes. What advice would you give if you see it in others in that similar situation where you can tell that ego is in the way and they're not letting you go? How would you show that?
You buy my book and you give it to them as a gift. And you say, this is a great book. I think you should read this, you know? You know, do they report to you? Or no.
Family, friend, whoever. I mean, yeah, in this situation, it's family.
Yeah. Well, you know, and again, I'm just, you know, here's the first thing that comes to my mind is, you know, you could say, gosh, you know, I've been doing some research and learning about this and I'm finding it fascinating and, you know, here's what I've learned and, you know, are you interested in, you know, I mean, you know, kind of bringing it up because truly when you know, one of the things that I like to say is you know, egotistical or, you know, the ego, I mean, it's a very common word, it's not a hard word, but my conclusion after all this work was that ego development, understanding ego development should be part of leadership development. And the other conclusion, in my one of the last pages of the book, I talk about, you know, what are my concluding thoughts, okay? And truly, one of my thoughts is, it's hard to be a good leader if you're not a good person, okay? Now, nobody's perfect, okay? But, you know, I'd rather have somebody say, you know, I didn't quite, and, you know, I often use my kids or as examples, you know, because there were times when they were in high school that, you know, many times I said, like if they didn't like their roles, I'd say, that is in my job description. Okay? That's part of my job description, and yes, you have to be in at midnight, or yes, I need to know who you're with, or, you know. But there were times when I said, okay, I'm not perfect. I don't have a PhD in parenting, okay? So I made a mistake. You know, cut me some slack, you know? Yes, you can come in, you can stay out till 12:30, but, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, I think, you know, just having those kinds of conversations and, so again, I think it's hard to be a good leader if you're not a good person, and it's hard to be a good person if you're not working at it. Because with society, constant challenges, you know, communication issues and stress and fast pace and, you know, the world, you know, everything's going faster. It's harder. It's just really harder. And so we have to work at it, I think. So, but good question.
I think what we'll do.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone coming, but I hope you'll stay and mingle a little bit and stay for the reception, and I'd be glad to answer any more questions. Thank you again for hosting me. Thank you.